Hello again. Something a bit different this week. I thought we would do a little bit of revision of social influence, and I thought it would be a good opportunity to show how we can apply our psychological knowledge to stuff that's happening in the world at the moment. So, today we're going to have a look at the processes of social change, which is what we looked at in the very first lockdown lesson. But we're going to apply it to the Black Lives Matter movement, which obviously you should be all aware of what's happening here. Okay, so as you are no doubt aware, the Black Lives Matter movement are protesting against systemic racism in both Britain and America. America is where it started, um, against the mistreatment of, initially it was against black people, but it has been extended again to sort of include all ethnic minority groups. So why now? Why is this all happening now? Well, you're probably aware from the news of what happened to George Floyd, who was a man who was unlawfully killed, murdered by three white police officers in Minnesota. Um, Not in itself that unusual. The statistics tell us in America, black people are killed at an extraordinary rate by the police. However, obviously, with the case of George Floyd, this was videoed and it went viral, and the whole world saw what happened. So, as a response, the Black Lives Matter movement have been protesting in America and also in the UK and around the world, fighting against systemic racism. um, so, I just want to talk a little bit about how we can apply the principles of social change to what's happened. You may recall, or you might need to look back at your notes from social change in the social influence section to remember that there are 6 stages of social change. We're going to focus on 5 of them here, through which minority influence can occur. This is the way a smaller number of people can change society, or change thinking. The first crucial stage of social change is drawing attention to an issue. And for that, we need to go back to 2017 and this incident with this guy, Colin Kaepernick, who was a American football player, an immensely successful American football player, who decided to take the knee during the national anthem. Um, he This wasn't just a flippant decision that he decided on a whim. This was something that he had planned to protest against police brutality towards black people, that had been happening in the year before. It was widely reported because obviously journalists were at the game, and as a result, it successfully drew attention to this issue. Um, Now, Kaepernick just didn't do it once. He continued to do it, and other NFL players continued to do it, and still continue to do it. Um, the 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 idea was that when the national anthem played, they would kneel down. Some people saw that as disrespectful, and we'll talk about that in a second. But they were consistently drawing attention to it. And if we look at all the psychological research on this, particularly Moscovici, now obviously Moscovici's research was done in an entirely different, it was a lab experiment involving perception of color. Um, but and we criticize Moscovici for, there's a spelling mistake there. That's annoying. We criticize Moscovici for not having ecological validity, but actually, when we look at real life situations, that does provide some validity to it. Moscovici said if the minority are going to be successful in challenging the majority and bringing about social change, they have to be consistent in their approach. And certainly taking the knee became a consistent way of showing uh, dissatisfaction with systemic racism. Stage three is deeper processing. Now, this is considered to be one of the most crucial stages if you're going to bring about internalization. If you want to create any sort of social influence that's long lasting, you need people to internalize the message. And in this case, one of the ways to do that is to force the majority to think about things in a different way. So, Kaepernick, by taking the knee during the national anthem, made people think, what does the national anthem represent? The national anthem is supposed to represent America and Americans. But of course, what he was pointing out is that some Americans have things considerably more difficult than others. And this idea that there is sort of a one nation was challenged by what Kaepernick were doing. Now, some people really got on board with that idea quite early. Others saw this as an act of defiance against America and an act of treason almost. One of those people being Trump, who at a rally in 2017 said, "Wouldn't you love to see one of those NFL owners, when someone disrespects our flag, to say, 'Get that son of a bitch off the field right now. Out. He's fired. He's fired.'" That's my worst Trump impression ever. So Trump really, really went for him, and put an awful lot of pressure on the NFL and other players to reject this. But by now, of course, Kaepernick had got an awful lot of media exposure and was really getting people to think about it. And in response to Trump's demand that they stop, the following Sunday, hundreds of other players started to do exactly the same thing as these photographs show. Not just black players, but players of all ethnicities started to take the knee in a sort of sign of solidarity. And so the movement begins to grow. One of the other crucial stages that you need to bring about social change is commitment, that the minority must appear to be committed to the cause. And for this silent kneeling protest of Kaepernick, he was fired by his American football team and not re signed by any other American football team in America. To this day, 3 years on, he is without a contract, even though he was one of the most successful players in his team of that season. Um, but this level of commitment that he showed, not backing down, is what is required to make the majority to really sort of evaluate their position and think, well, this guy's serious. Equally, the more recent Black Lives Matters movements around the world, in the wake of what happened with George Floyd, can be shown to be seeing commitment as well, because they've gone out in the middle of a global pandemic, risking their health, to protest in cities all around the world. That shows commitment. This is not just, oh, I'm gonna, black out my profile on social media. This shows a greater level of commitment than that. I mean, despite being blacklisted by NFL teams, Kaepernick did sign a multi-million pound contract with Nike, which again sort of boosts the exposure. Even though he's not actually a practicing sportsman at the moment, he is a face of Nike. They could see the way the social change was occurring, and they obviously, they're a money making organization. They thought, you know, he's a good man to have on board. And in fairness, he has actually changed some of Nike's working practices, and some of the ideas that they wanted to bring in have been ditched because he said this is not a good idea. So they did, back him once he got that. The final stage that we need to bring about social change is the snowball effect. So called because you start off with a little snowball, it rolls downhill and gets bigger and bigger and bigger as it goes on. till it reaches a tipping point. And at that point, the minority is now the majority. And a different form of social influence will take place. Now, people will start conforming to what the new majority is. The symbolic act of taking the knee has swept the world from sort of fairly humble beginnings 3 years ago with Kaepernick. And obviously, he was inspired by the original civil rights protesters, Martin Luther King, who did used to take the knee in prayer. But this is not so much a religious sign now as very much a symbol of the Black Lives Matter movement. And hundreds of thousands of protesters around the world now take the knee as a sign, as a symbol. And this is a good illustration of the snowball effect. Did it bring about social change? Well, almost certainly. Shortly after the Black Lives Matters protests started happening, all four officers that were involved in George Floyd's death, not just the guy who was, responsible for murdering him, but the other three officers that didn't intervene and stop it happening, have all been charged. And this indicates, that social change is occurring, and it will continue to occur. So, there you go. That was just some thoughts, really, about how you could apply psychology to the world as it is at the moment, which is kind of the whole point about us doing this subject. Um, it's unlikely that this will come up as an exam question while you're sitting your exams because of obvious reasons with the pandemic and whether or not the exams will be using standardized questions and stuff like that. But, in theory, in future years, they could say, using the Black Lives Matter movement as an example, explain how social influence leads to social change. Probably be about 6 marks, and they would want you to go through the process that I've just described. And although your exam is unlikely to discuss the Black Lives Matter movement itself, if they just asked about the end of that, explain how social influence leads to social change, you can use whatever example you want. So you could use the Black Lives Matter movement, and I'm sure the examiner would be very impressed in your ability to apply psychological knowledge to a current issue. Okay, thank you very much for listening, and I hope that is both useful in terms of revision, but also maybe get you to think about how you might apply other things that you've learned in psychology to what's happening around the world. Thanks, guys, and I'll see you next week.